The price of mercy. They put a bounty on her life. Elena had always been a person who noticed the little things most people ignored. Even as a child, she could not walk past someone in need without offering a hand, a smile, or a kind word. Growing up in a small town surrounded by mountains and narrow cobbled streets, she learned early on that life was not always fair, and that sometimes the smallest gestures could make the biggest difference.
Her parents, both school teachers, taught her the value of empathy and honesty.
They often told her that true strength was not in wealth or power, but in being kind when it was hard, in standing up for what was right, and in helping those who could not help themselves. By the time she was in her late 20s, Elena had quietly become a pillar of the community. People in the town would often recognize her walking down the streets carrying groceries for an elderly neighbor, sitting with children in the park to read them stories, or bringing meals to families who were struggling. Despite her own modest life, she never hesitated to share what she had. Some called her selfless or generous, but Elena never considered herself a hero. She simply believed that everyone deserved a chance, that no one should have to face life's challenges alone, and that kindness, however small, mattered. Her work often extended beyond ordinary acts of goodwill. She had a particular interest in helping the town's refugee families who had arrived quietly in search of safety. Many of these families had endured unimaginable hardships, war, poverty, and loss, and Elena was determined to make them feel welcome. She taught children how to read and write in a new language, helped adults fill out forms for schools and jobs, and organized small gatherings where people could share their stories. These efforts were not about recognition. She simply felt that everyone deserved dignity and a sense of belonging. Despite her busy life, Elena maintained a sense of warmth and humor that drew people to her. She had a smile that could light up a room, and a voice that was calm but confident. Children loved her for her patience. Adults respected her for her courage, and even strangers often found themselves touched by her genuine concern. She had a way of listening that made people feel understood, not judged. Many in the town began to see her as a quiet force of good, a person who could inspire hope even in the darkest moments. But not everyone appreciated her presence. As Elena's acts of mercy became more visible, some powerful figures in the town began to feel threatened. A few local business owners and politicians who had long taken advantage of people through corruption or exploitation saw Elena as a challenge to their control. She would quietly question unfair practices, help those who had been cheated, and occasionally report issues that had gone unnoticed by the authorities. Though she never sought conflict, her honesty and courage began to disrupt the comfortable routines of those who had grown used to bending rules for their benefit. Elena noticed the change subtly at first. A delivery she expected would be late. A stranger would linger too long near her home. Rumors would spread quietly through the town. People she had trusted seemed to hesitate when she entered a room, eyes darting as if unsure how to respond. She did not panic. She had learned that fear alone could cloud judgment. But she did take notice. Her instincts, sharpened by years of observing people, told her that not everyone was pleased with her work, and that some might wish she would simply disappear. Even with these growing tensions, Elena refused to change her ways. Every morning she rose early, preparing for another day of work. She made herself breakfast, checked on her neighbors, and then visited the small center she had helped establish for children and families. The center was modest, a converted community hall, but it was a place of safety, laughter, and learning. Inside, walls were painted with bright colors, shelves filled with books and games, and a small garden outside provided vegetables for anyone in need. Elena had poured her heart into this space, and it had become a beacon of hope in the town. One crisp morning, as she walked through the narrow streets to open the center, she noticed a small crowd gathered near the market. Children laughed and played, while adults chatted and traded news. Yet among them were subtle signs of unease, quick glances, whispered words, and a sense that people were holding back. Elena's heart ached at the thought that fear might already be creeping into the community she had worked so hard to nurture. She took a deep breath and reminded herself why she continued, why she believed that even in a world where darkness existed, light could still shine if people chose to protect it. As the day progressed, Elena greeted families, taught lessons, and helped repair a small leaking roof in the center. Each interaction reminded her why she persevered. A boy who had struggled to read a single word last week now read a full sentence aloud, and the pride on his face filled her with joy. A mother who had feared losing her home shared a grateful smile, telling Elena that her support had made all the difference. These moments, small but profound, were the reason Elena could not stop, even when the whispers of danger grew louder. By the evening, Elena returned home, weary but content. She sat by her window, looking out at the quiet streets, and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She knew her work had impact, and she understood that it was not always safe to stand against those who sought power through fear. Yet she felt a quiet resolve settle in her chest. She would continue to help, to protect, and to serve, because she believed that life was worth fighting for, not through violence or revenge, but through compassion, understanding, and courage. The days that followed were marked by both joy and subtle tension. Elena could feel the eyes of some watching her, the occasional cold greeting or suspicious glance. She did not allow it to deter her. Instead, she took greater care in her planning, ensuring that the families she helped were safe, that the children in her center had everything they needed, and that the community could continue to grow stronger in the face of challenges. Her quiet determination became her shield, and her unwavering kindness became her most powerful tool. Evenings often found her walking along the riverbank near her home, where the water reflected the fading sunlight. Here she could think, breathe, and prepare for the work that awaited her the next day. She imagined a future where every child had access to education, every family had a safe place to live, and every act of kindness could ripple through the town to create lasting change. It was a vision that kept her moving forward, even as the weight of unspoken threats began to press upon her life. Though she did not yet know the full extent of the dangers ahead, Elena's story was already one of courage. She had chosen a path that was neither easy nor safe, but it was one she believed in with every fiber of her being. And as the night settled over the small town, she allowed herself a quiet hope that even in a world where power and greed could cast shadows, mercy, bravery, and steadfast humanity could still make a difference. Unbeknownst to her, the seeds of conflict were already planted. Those who felt threatened by her compassion were beginning to speak in hushed tones, plotting ways to silence her influence. But for now, Elena remained unaware of the full storm approaching. She focused only on what she could do today: the meals to prepare, the children to teach, the families to comfort. For Elena, life was not measured by wealth or recognition, but by the lives she could touch, the hope she could inspire, and the courage she could embody. And in that quiet determination, the story of a woman who chose mercy over fear began to unfold. A story that would soon test the limits of her bravery and the depth of her resolve, showing the world just how far one person's compassion could reach. Elena's life had settled into a rhythm that felt natural and comforting, but the peace she cherished was beginning to show cracks. At first, they were subtle. A delivery that had always arrived promptly would sometimes be late. Someone unfamiliar would appear outside her home, lingering longer than seemed normal. And occasionally, a conversation she overheard in the market would trail off when she approached. These small signs could have been coincidences, but Elena had learned to trust her instincts. Something was changing, and she could feel it in the quiet tension that seemed to hover around her. She tried to brush it off at first, convincing herself that it was only the result of the town's normal curiosity. After all, she was a familiar face, someone who interacted with many people every day. Still, a shadow of concern settled in her mind. It was one thing to be admired, it was another to be watched, scrutinized, and judged for simply being compassionate. Elena had seen how easily jealousy and fear could grow among people who preferred the status quo, and she began to realize that her good deeds were starting to disturb those who thrived on control and complacency. One morning, as she walked through the market to buy ingredients for the center, she noticed a stranger leaning against a stall. He was neatly dressed, though nothing about him suggested he belonged there. His eyes followed her movements carefully, lingering longer than was polite. Elena felt a small knot of unease tighten in her stomach, but she kept walking, reminding herself that fear could cloud judgment. She greeted familiar vendors with a warm smile, chatted briefly with children playing nearby, and tried to maintain the calm demeanor she was known for. Yet, the sense of being watched refused to leave. By the afternoon, subtle signs of hostility became harder to ignore. A friend she often met for tea appeared hesitant, almost nervous, when they exchanged greetings. Another neighbor who had once eagerly asked for Elena's advice on family matters seemed unusually reserved. Even small acts of kindness, like helping a woman carry her groceries, now drew curious and sometimes suspicious glances. Elena began to realize that her presence was no longer universally welcomed. Some people were uncomfortable, and others, though she did not yet know who, were likely plotting in quiet corners, frustrated by her influence. Despite the growing tension, Elena refused to let fear dictate her actions. She continued her work at the community center, teaching lessons, preparing meals, and organizing small gatherings where families could connect. She focused especially on children, believing that education and encouragement could transform their futures. That afternoon, she helped a young boy named Amir, who had struggled with reading, sound out the words in a storybook. His face lit up with pride and confidence, and in that moment, Elena felt a renewed sense of purpose. These small victories reminded her why she could not stop, even when the shadows of opposition began to loom. Yet the challenges were mounting in ways she could not ignore. Anonymous letters began arriving at the center, folded neatly, but carrying messages that were meant to intimidate. They were not threatening in the traditional sense. There were no demands, no direct warnings, but the words were carefully chosen to create unease. "Some things are better left alone," one letter read. "Your actions are being noticed." Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she read it, but she did not allow panic to take hold. Instead, she kept the letters in a safe place and showed them to a trusted colleague, discussing ways to ensure everyone at the center felt safe. The subtle harassment extended beyond letters. One morning, she discovered that a supply order she had placed for the center had been delayed inexplicably. Items that should have arrived in a single day took a week to reach her, and when they finally did, some were missing or damaged. It was easy to dismiss as an error, but combined with the other signs, the letters, the unusual glances, the lingering strangers, Elena could not ignore the possibility that someone was attempting to disrupt her work. She began to take small precautions, like locking doors earlier than usual and keeping a closer eye on deliveries. One evening after the center had closed, Elena decided to take a walk along the riverbank to clear her mind. The water reflected the orange glow of the setting sun, and the gentle sound of rippling water was soothing. She thought about the people she helped, the children who had learned to read, the families she had assisted in finding stability. Each memory was a reminder of why she persisted. Yet she also acknowledged the growing tension in her life. She had always believed that doing good required courage, but now she understood that courage alone was not always enough. Careful planning and awareness were also essential. Her reflection was interrupted when she noticed two men standing on the path ahead. They were talking quietly, but their eyes were fixed on her. Elena slowed her pace, pretending to tie her shoe, hoping they would move along. Instead, they remained, exchanging glances and murmurs. Elena felt a surge of anxiety but refused to show it. She took a deep breath and continued walking, keeping her gaze calm and neutral. The men eventually moved away, disappearing into the shadows, but the encounter left her more alert than ever. She realized that she was entering a new phase in her life, one where vigilance was as necessary as compassion. Back at the center the next day, Elena gathered her colleagues to discuss the changes she had noticed. They shared their own observations, small acts of interference, suspicious behavior, and subtle attempts to undermine the center's work. Together, they created a plan to ensure the safety of everyone involved. They would double-check deliveries, maintain a log of visitors, and remain vigilant for unusual behavior. Elena knew that the challenges ahead would not be easy, but she also understood that she could not abandon the community that relied on her. In the weeks that followed, the subtle harassment escalated in small, unsettling ways. Supplies were misplaced or delayed. Strangers appeared near the center, sometimes taking notes or asking questions under the guise of casual conversation. A few parents expressed concern about their children attending the programs, though most continued to trust Elena. The quiet unease began to affect the children, who could sense tension even if they did not understand it fully. Elena responded with patience and reassurance, explaining that sometimes people feel uncomfortable with change, and that courage meant continuing to do what was right, even when others doubted or disapproved. One afternoon, as Elena prepared for a storytelling session, a group of children ran to her with news. "Someone was asking about you," one whispered. "They wanted to know who comes here every day and what we do." Elena's heart tightened. She realized that the disruption was no longer just indirect or subtle. It was beginning to touch the people she cared about most. She calmly spoke to the children, reassuring them that the center was a safe place and that they should not worry. Then she made a private note to meet with her trusted colleagues and discuss additional measures to protect everyone. Even with the growing tension, Elena found ways to maintain hope. She focused on small acts of goodness. A teacher struggling with a lesson received guidance. A mother learning a new skill was encouraged. A group of children created handmade decorations for the center's walls. These moments reminded her that light could persist even when shadows loomed nearby. Every smile, every word of thanks, and every small victory reinforced her belief that her work was meaningful and necessary. By the end of the month, Elena had settled into a careful routine. She continued her work with the children and families, but with added vigilance. Died intention to be unfamiliar faces, and took precautions to ensure that the center remained a safe haven.
Though a part of her worried about what might come next, she refused to let fear dominate her life.
Her philosophy remained unchanged. Mercy, courage, and kindness were worth the risks, even when they were uncomfortable or dangerous. One evening, as she closed the center and prepared to leave, Elena paused for a moment outside. The streets were quiet, and the sky was painted with the soft colors of dusk. She thought about the subtle signs that had emerged over the past weeks. The letters, the lingering strangers, the interference with supplies. She understood that these challenges were only the beginning. The people who felt threatened by her actions were growing bolder, and the world she had known was starting to shift. Yet she also felt a quiet determination settle in her heart. She would not retreat. She would continue to protect, to teach, and to care for the people who relied on her. Elena's life had entered a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty and tension. But it was also a chapter where courage, hope, and compassion mattered more than ever. She knew that the days ahead would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined, but she was prepared to face them. With every step she took, she reaffirmed her commitment to mercy and kindness, understanding that sometimes doing good required patience, vigilance, and unwavering determination. And so, as the town settled into the evening hush, Elena walked home with a quiet confidence. She knew that challenges were coming, that the road ahead might be difficult, and that the opposition she faced could become more apparent. But she also knew that her purpose was clear: to continue doing what was right, to protect those in need, and to ensure that her acts of mercy would shine even in the presence of fear and opposition. Her story was no longer just about simple acts of kindness. It was about resilience, vigilance, and the courage to face an unseen threat with dignity and grace. And as she stepped inside her home, closing the door gently behind her, Elena knew that the real test of her character and the depth of her courage was only just beginning. The following weeks brought a shift in Elena's world. What had begun as subtle warnings and strange encounters had grown into something more deliberate, though still carefully hidden. The town that had once felt safe now carried an undercurrent of unease. Elena noticed it in the way some people avoided eye contact, in hushed conversations that paused whenever she approached, and in the occasional glance of someone she didn't recognize, lingering too long. She realized that her work, her acts of kindness, and her unwavering honesty were no longer just admirable. They had become a source of discomfort to certain people who preferred that things remain as they were. Elena tried to focus on the center, on the children and families she had promised to support. But it was harder now. Every trip to the market, every errand, every interaction seemed to carry a subtle tension. She would often pause to scan the streets, notice who was nearby, and watch for patterns that might suggest danger. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Yet, she refused to let fear take control. Elena reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward despite it. Then, one afternoon, a message arrived that changed everything. It was left at the center, folded neatly and placed where she would find it. The words inside were clear, direct, and chilling in their quiet certainty. Some are watching closely. Your actions have consequences. Consider carefully what you are doing. Elena read the note twice, feeling a chill run through her body. It was not a threat in the usual sense. There were no demands, no promises of harm. But the meaning was unmistakable. Someone wanted her to stop. Someone was serious about making her reconsider her work. For a moment, Elena sat quietly, her mind racing. She thought about the children who waited for her lessons, the families who trusted her guidance, and the people in her community who depended on her presence. She knew that stepping back would leave them vulnerable. And yet the note made her realize that the opposition was no longer passive. It was deliberate, focused, and calculated. The world she had once trusted had become a place where kindness could provoke fear, suspicion, and even danger. Elena spent that evening discussing the note with her closest colleagues. They were a small, dedicated team who had worked alongside her for years, sharing her vision of a safe and nurturing community. Together, they brainstormed ways to maintain the center's programs while increasing security. They considered discreet measures, keeping logs of visitors, arranging schedules to avoid large gatherings in vulnerable areas, and communicating more carefully with families. Elena felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She understood that her choices now affected not only her life but also the lives of everyone around her. Despite the tension, Elena refused to let the center fall into fear. The next day, she welcomed the children as usual, teaching lessons, telling stories, and organizing activities with the same warmth and patience she had always shown. But she remained vigilant. She noticed small changes in her environment, a delivery that was slightly later than expected, an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the center, a stranger lingering at the gate. She recorded each occurrence in a small notebook, a habit she had begun after the first subtle warnings. It was a way of preparing, of understanding the patterns, and of protecting those in her care. One afternoon, a parent approached her with concern. "Elena," she said softly, "someone asked about the children here. They wanted to know who attends, what you teach, and when activities happen. They seemed very curious." Elena felt a knot tighten in her chest. The world she had tried to make safe for children and families was becoming a place where their presence could be noticed and monitored by people with unknown intentions. She thanked the parent for sharing the information and reassured her that she would take steps to ensure that everyone remained protected. As the days passed, Elena's awareness grew sharper. She began noticing patterns that previously would have escaped her attention. The same strangers appeared at different locations in town, always watching, always observing. She recognized certain vehicles that seemed to follow her during her morning walks. The experience was unsettling, but it also strengthened her resolve. Elena knew that fear could be contagious, and she refused to allow it to touch the children or families she supported. She became meticulous in her planning, arranging lessons and activities in ways that minimized risk while still offering comfort and joy. One evening after the center had closed, Elena returned home to find another note tucked beneath her door. This one was more pointed, though still carefully phrased. "Consider your choices carefully. Not everyone values your kind heart." The words were meant to unsettle her, and they did. She felt a mix of concern, frustration, and determination. She understood that the opposition was no longer content with subtle interference. They wanted her attention, wanted her to hesitate, and perhaps even wanted her to retreat. But Elena refused to allow their intentions to dictate her life. That night, she sat by her window, reflecting on the situation. She thought about all the people she had helped, the families who relied on her guidance, and the children who smiled brighter because of her presence. She realized that her choices were now more important than ever. Every act of kindness, every lesson taught, and every comforting word was a statement of resilience. It was a refusal to let fear overshadow compassion. Elena understood that the path she had chosen carried risks, but she also knew that abandoning it would leave others vulnerable to the very forces she sought to oppose. In the following week, Elena began to notice more direct signs of monitoring. A neighbor mentioned seeing unfamiliar individuals near the center's entrance. A friend reported receiving questions from strangers about Elena's schedule. Even routine errands seemed to carry hidden scrutiny. It was clear that someone was keeping track of her movements and actions. Yet, instead of panic, Elena felt a growing determination. She would not allow herself or her community to be intimidated. She redoubled her efforts, teaching, supporting, and guiding with the same warmth she had always shown, while taking extra precautions to ensure everyone's safety. The tension reached a new level when one morning as she arrived at the center, she noticed a small group of people standing near the entrance. They appeared to be passers-by, but their attention was unmistakably focused on the center. Elena approached calmly, smiling politely, and spoke with them briefly. They claimed to be new residents, curious about local programs. Elena welcomed them warmly, answering their questions with care. Yet, once inside, she quickly reviewed her plan for the day, ensuring that activities could proceed safely and that children were not exposed to potential risks. She realized that vigilance was no longer optional, it was essential. Despite the growing pressure, Elena found ways to maintain normalcy. She celebrated small achievements with the children. A story successfully read aloud, a craft completed, a game won fairly. She encouraged families to continue participating in programs, reassuring them that the center was a place of safety and growth. Her ability to balance caution with compassion became her greatest strength. Even as the presence of unknown observers grew more noticeable, the atmosphere inside the center remained nurturing and supportive, a testament to her resilience and commitment. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging day, Elena took a quiet walk along the river. The water flowed gently, reflecting the pale light of the early evening. She allowed herself a moment of calm, thinking about the challenges she faced and the community she had vowed to protect. She realized that the opposition she confronted was not just a distant threat, it was a constant, pressing reality. And yet she also understood that courage was not defined by the absence of fear, but by the decision to act in spite of it. In the following weeks, Elena implemented small security measures without alarming anyone. She adjusted schedules, monitored arrivals more closely, and kept detailed notes of unusual activity. The letters and messages became less frequent, but the sense of being watched never fully disappeared. It was a silent tension, a quiet reminder that the world she had tried to improve was also capable of resistance. And yet, with every lesson taught, every act of support offered, and every smile shared, Elena reinforced her commitment to her work and her community. By the end of this period, Elena had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. She was more alert, more cautious, and more deliberate in her actions, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had learned that true courage required balance, an ability to act with compassion while remaining aware of potential risks. And she had learned that the opposition, no matter how determined, could not diminish the impact of genuine kindness. The love, trust, and respect she had cultivated within the community were stronger than the fear that sought to challenge them. Elena's story was evolving into something more complex than simple acts of mercy. It was now a story of resilience, vigilance, and quiet determination in the face of deliberate opposition. The opposition had made their presence known, but they had not shaken her resolve. And as she prepared for the next day, planning lessons, activities, and support for the families who relied on her, she understood that her courage and her compassion would be tested further. Her life had changed in ways she could not yet fully predict. The challenges were becoming more pronounced, the stakes higher, and the responsibility greater. But Elena remained committed to her mission. She had learned that doing what was right often required patience, strategy, and courage. And she knew that as long as she continued to act with integrity, the light she brought into her community could not be extinguished. Elena's journey through these weeks marked a turning point. The subtle signs of monitoring and intimidation had transformed into clear messages and calculated observation. She could feel the tension in the air, in the streets, and in the whispers of the town. Yet with each day she demonstrated that courage, patience, An unwavering kindness could persist even in the presence of unseen challenges. And so, as night fell over the town and Elena closed the center for another day, she knew that the real test was approaching. The world outside was growing more uncertain, the opposition more deliberate, and the risks more tangible. But she also knew that her commitment, her compassion, and her courage would guide her through the trials ahead. Her story was no longer only about mercy, it was about standing strong, protecting those who could not protect themselves, and facing the consequences of kindness with dignity and grace. The tension that had been growing in Elena's life over the past weeks finally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. The subtle warnings and careful observations had escalated into direct actions that tested her courage and her ability to protect those around her. It was no longer just about the letters, the strangers, or the strange questions from neighbors. Now, the world she had worked so hard to build, a place of learning, safety, and kindness, was under pressure in ways she had never imagined. It began with small disruptions that were difficult to attribute to coincidence. A shipment of educational materials arrived late, some items missing, some slightly damaged. It seemed almost harmless, but for Elena, it was a clear signal. Someone wanted to make her work more difficult. She discussed it with her colleagues at the center, reminding them to remain calm and focus on solutions. They brainstormed ways to continue their programs without interruption, ensuring that no child missed out on a lesson or activity. Each challenge, Elena realized, required not just courage, but careful planning and attention to detail. Then came the rumors. They began quietly, whispers in the market, murmurs from parents who were suddenly more cautious than before. Some claimed that certain people in town were questioning the center's intentions, suggesting that the programs were too ambitious or strange. Elena knew that such gossip could easily frighten the families she supported, and she took immediate steps to reassure them. She spoke personally with parents, answering questions, explaining her plans, and emphasizing that the center remained a safe and welcoming place. She knew that transparency and trust were her strongest tools against fear. Even with these measures, Elena could feel the weight of the opposition pressing closer. She noticed that familiar faces she had trusted began to hesitate when she walked past, that vendors in the market seemed unusually cautious, and that some friends were less forthcoming with information. It was as though an invisible wall had been placed between her and the town she had once known so well. Elena felt the sting of isolation, but she refused to let it affect her work. She reminded herself that meaningful change often stirred resistance, and that courage required persistence even when others faltered. One afternoon, as she was preparing a new lesson plan, Elena received a call from a parent whose child attended the center. The voice on the other end was careful, hesitant, almost fearful. "Elena," the parent said, "someone came to ask questions about the schedule here, about the children and what they do. I don't know who they are, but they seemed very serious." Elena felt a knot tighten in her chest. She realized that the scrutiny she had sensed was no longer passive. It had become deliberate and targeted. Yet, instead of panicking, she wrote down the details, promised to take precautions, and reassured the parent that everyone would remain safe. The community center itself became a focal point of vigilance. Elena began scheduling activities with greater care, ensuring that children were always accompanied by adults, that doors and windows were secured, and that the staff were fully aware of any unusual activity. She taught the children about awareness in a gentle, age-appropriate way, explaining that sometimes people might be curious or unsure, and that it was important to stay close and communicate openly with trusted adults. The children responded well, feeling safe and reassured by her calm leadership. As the weeks passed, Elena's own sense of personal risk grew. She began noticing unfamiliar vehicles parked near her home, people lingering at corners as she walked to the center, and messages that arrived in subtle, indirect ways. Some were anonymous notes placed on her doorstep. Others were questions asked casually in conversation by people she did not know well. The implication was clear. Someone was monitoring her closely. And while there was no immediate danger, the pressure was enough to make Elena reconsider her routines and plan for possible emergencies. Elena's colleagues noticed her growing vigilance. They could see the way she paused before entering rooms, the way she scanned the streets before leaving the center, and the careful way she handled any unexpected visitors. While they admired her composure, they also understood the weight of responsibility she carried. Together, they discussed strategies to maintain the center's programs without compromising safety. They organized small teams to accompany Elena on errands, arranged staggered schedules, and ensured that every activity had a clear plan for any unexpected events. Elena understood that leadership meant not just guiding her community, but also protecting it in practical ways. The strain was not limited to the center. Elena noticed it at home as well. Friends who once stopped by for casual visits now called ahead, checking that it was safe. Even simple errands like grocery shopping required greater attention and awareness. She learned to be cautious without letting fear dominate her decisions. She developed routines, checking streets, noting unfamiliar faces, and always keeping her phone nearby. Each precaution, however small, reinforced her confidence and allowed her to continue her work without compromising safety. Despite the constant pressure, Elena never allowed herself to lose sight of her mission. She found small moments of joy, watching a child read for the first time, hearing a family express gratitude for guidance, seeing the community come together to support one another. These moments reminded her why she continued, why she faced the challenges head-on, and why she refused to let external pressures dictate her choices. Elena knew that her compassion had consequences, but she also knew that the benefits far outweighed the risks. One day, a group of parents approached her with concern. They had noticed an unusual amount of curiosity about the center, questions about schedules, and the presence of unfamiliar individuals near entrances. Elena listened carefully, thanked them for sharing their observations, and immediately implemented new measures. She adjusted pickup and drop-off procedures for children, created designated safe areas within the center, and reinforced communication with all families to ensure that everyone felt secure. She explained to the parents that awareness and preparation were essential, and that they were all part of a community that looked out for one another. Even as the opposition grew more noticeable, Elena found ways to maintain hope and normalcy. She organized special activities for the children, storytelling sessions, art projects, small celebrations, and ensured that families could continue to participate safely. Her calm demeanor reassured everyone, showing that challenges, no matter how difficult, could be managed with careful planning and courage. The center became a symbol not just of learning and growth, but of resilience and unity in the face of pressure. In the evenings, Elena often reflected on the changes in her life. She thought about how far she had come, the lives she had touched, and the community she had helped nurture. She understood that the opposition she faced was not personal. It was a response to her influence, her courage, and her dedication. And she realized that every act of kindness carried weight, every choice had consequences, and every effort to protect and guide others required both wisdom and vigilance. Despite the mounting pressure, Elena remained determined. She developed a plan for emergencies, ensuring that every staff member and family knew how to respond to unusual situations. She refined her schedules, reinforced communication, and stayed alert to changes in her environment. Her approach was calm, measured, and deliberate, reflecting the depth of her experience and the strength of her commitment. She knew that life would not always be easy, that challenges could arise at any moment, and that her responsibility extended beyond herself to every person she served. As the days turned into weeks, Elena noticed small victories amid the tension. The children continued to thrive, families remained engaged, and the programs at the center ran smoothly. Even with the opposition watching, the work she had built continued to make a difference. Elena felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that her efforts were not in vain. She had learned that courage was not about fearlessness, but about perseverance, careful planning, and unwavering commitment to what was right. One evening, as she closed the center and walked home, Elena paused to look at the street she had walked countless times. She thought about the subtle threats, the pressure she faced, and the responsibilities she carried. Yet she also thought about the children laughing inside the center, the families she had guided, and the small but meaningful ways her work had transformed lives. She understood that her journey was far from over, that challenges were only becoming more complex, and that the next phase would demand even greater courage and resilience. Elena's life had changed fundamentally. The consequences of her actions were no longer theoretical. They were real, tangible, and pressing. The opposition had made itself known, and she had seen that her kindness, her compassion, and her commitment to justice were forces that could provoke tension and scrutiny. Yet, she remained steadfast. She knew that the work she had started, the community she had nurtured, and the values she upheld were worth any challenge that might come. Her story had evolved from simple acts of kindness to a journey of resilience, strategy, and determination. Elena had learned that doing what was right often carried consequences, and that facing those consequences required not only courage, but careful thought and preparation. She had also learned that even in the face of scrutiny, opposition, and uncertainty, the impact of compassion could persist and flourish. And as she stepped inside her home that evening, closing the door behind her, Elena felt a quiet sense of resolve. The opposition had made itself visible, the pressure was real, and the challenges were increasing. Yet she knew that the values she lived by, kindness, courage, and unwavering commitment to others, were unshakable. She had faced the consequences of her mercy, and she was ready to continue, knowing that the next chapter of her life would demand even more strength, vigilance, and determination. Life for Elena had reached a point where every day carried both opportunity and responsibility. The challenges she had faced over the past months, the subtle threats, the scrutiny, the careful planning, had changed her in ways she could feel deep in her bones. She had learned to balance caution with courage, vigilance with compassion, and awareness with generosity. Yet as she moved through her routines, teaching, guiding, and helping, she began to realize that the most important lessons were not just for the children or families she served. They were also for herself. The community center had survived the pressures and scrutiny of those who had tried to challenge her. The children still laughed in the play area, families continued to attend classes and programs, and a sense of trust and safety remained in the walls Elena had worked so hard to nurture. She felt a quiet pride in that, not pride born of ego, but pride born of seeing her vision continue despite difficulties. Every smile, every word of thanks, every smile accomplishment was a reminder that perseverance and kindness could endure, even when the world seemed uncertain. Elena also began to notice changes in the community itself. The people she had helped, the family she had guided, and the children she had taught were beginning to carry forward the lessons of courage, empathy, and resilience. Parents spoke more openly about their hopes and dreams. Children supported one another in small but meaningful ways, and neighbors who had once been quiet began to engage more actively in community programs. Elena understood that her work had created ripples, and that those ripples were growing. The strength of a community could not be measured only by its resources, but by the care and trust people shared with one another. Her personal life had changed as well. Elena was more alert and careful in her daily routines, more deliberate in her choices, and more aware of the consequences of every action. She still enjoyed simple pleasures. The quiet mornings when the sun rose over the mountains, the walks along the riverbank, the soft chatter of children in the park, but these moments were tinged with awareness. She had learned that vigilance did not have to replace joy. It could coexist with it, creating a life that was both meaningful and grounded. Elena reflected on the challenges she had faced. The letters, the subtle monitoring, the questions from strangers, the cautious whispers, each had tested her resolve. Yet she realized that those challenges had also strengthened her. She had learned to trust her instincts, to plan carefully, to communicate openly, and to remain calm under pressure. She had discovered that courage was not about the absence of fear, but about choosing to act in spite of it. And she had discovered that compassion, even when it carried consequences, could inspire others to act, grow, and persevere. The children at the center continued to thrive. Elena remembered the shy boy who had struggled with reading, and the young girl who had once been too timid to speak in class. Both had grown in confidence. Both had learned to express themselves, and both had learned to value their own abilities. She saw the results of her dedication not only in their accomplishments, but also in their kindness toward one another. Elena understood that by nurturing confidence and empathy in these children, she was helping to build a future that could withstand challenges and spread hope. She also recognized the quiet acts of support that had helped her through difficult times. Colleagues who stayed vigilant, Neighbors who shared information discreetly, and parents who trusted her guidance had all played a role in sustaining the center's mission. Elena realized that courage and compassion were not solitary qualities. She felt gratitude for the people who had stood by her, often quietly, and for the small network of allies who ensured that her work could continue safely. As the weeks turned into months, Elena considered the impact of the opposition she had faced. It was clear that her work had made an impression, not all positive, but she chose to focus on the lessons it offered. She learned to anticipate challenges without becoming paralyzed by them, to protect her community without instilling fear, and to act decisively without sacrificing kindness. The scrutiny she had faced had forced her to refine her approach, to communicate more clearly, and to recognize the subtle dynamics of human behavior. It had also reminded her that change, even when it provokes discomfort in others, is a necessary part of progress. One evening after the center had closed and the children had gone home, Elena took a long walk along the riverbank. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. She reflected on the journey she had taken, from the quiet days of simply helping neighbors to the challenges of scrutiny and opposition, to the present moment where her work was flourishing despite the pressure she had faced. She realized that life was a series of challenges and responses, of choices and consequences, and that courage, empathy, and integrity were the guides that could navigate those challenges successfully. Elena also thought about the long-term impact of her actions. The children she had taught would carry lessons of compassion and resilience into their own lives. The families she had guided would remember the support they had received and would share that kindness with others. Even those who had opposed her indirectly had been forced to recognize the influence of her work, to see that empathy and determination could not easily be dismissed. She understood that the true measure of her efforts was not just the immediate results, but the lasting effect on her community, and the ripple of positive change that would continue long after she was gone. Despite the successes, Elena remained humble. She knew that her journey was not complete, and that challenges could still arise. She also knew that life could bring unforeseen difficulties, and that vigilance and care would always be necessary. Yet she was not afraid. She had learned to face uncertainty with calm determination, to navigate obstacles with patience and intelligence, and to inspire confidence in those around her. She understood that the work of mercy and compassion was never finished, and that each day offered an opportunity to continue making a difference. The center continued to serve as a sanctuary for those who needed it most. Families came for guidance, children came for education and play, and the community found support in the safe environment Elena had fostered. Each day, the laughter of children, the quiet concentration of learners, and the shared stories of families reinforced the importance of her work. Elena felt satisfaction not as a reward but as affirmation that persistence, empathy, and dedication could create lasting change. She also took time to reflect on herself. The experiences of the past months had shaped her in profound ways. She had learned patience, caution, and foresight. She had discovered inner strength she did not know she possessed, and had seen the power of community in action. Most importantly, she had learned that true courage was a combination of heart and mind, empathy and strategy, kindness and vigilance, hope and practicality. These lessons would guide her not only in her current work, but in every challenge that lay ahead. Elena knew that her story was part of a larger story, the story of the community, of the families, of the children whose lives she touched. She understood that one person's actions could influence many, that small acts of kindness could ripple outward, and that courage in the face of adversity could inspire others to act with integrity. Her life was no longer just about her own choices. It was about the way those choices could shape a world that was kinder, safer, and more hopeful. As she prepared for the evening, Elena paused to write in her journal. She reflected on the months of challenges, the moments of doubt, the small victories, and the quiet acts of support from her community. She wrote about the lessons she had learned, the gratitude she felt, and the hope she carried for the future. She reminded herself that the journey of mercy was ongoing, that obstacles would continue to arise, and that resilience and compassion were the tools that would guide her forward. In the quiet moments of reflection, Elena understood the full measure of her experiences. She had faced scrutiny, challenges, and opposition, But she had also experienced growth, connection, and fulfillment. She had learned to balance courage with caution, vigilance with kindness, and leadership with humility. She had seen firsthand the power of empathy to transform lives and the importance of persistence in the face of adversity. Her story was no longer just about mercy, it was about strength, wisdom, and the lasting impact of one person's dedication to doing what is right. And so, as Elena looked out over the town from her small window that evening, she felt a sense of calm and purpose. The challenges she had faced were real. The consequences had been tangible, but she had endured with integrity and compassion. She knew that life would continue to bring obstacles, that change would always be met with resistance, and that the work of building a safe, supportive community was never complete. Yet she also knew that the foundation she had laid, with courage, care, and dedication, was strong, and that the ripples of her actions would continue to influence lives for years to come. Elena closed her journal, took a deep breath, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had faced the consequences of mercy, navigated the pressure of scrutiny, and continued her work with unwavering commitment. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, that leadership required both empathy and strategy, and that kindness could endure even in the face of opposition. And in that moment she understood that her journey, though challenging, had created a lasting legacy of hope, resilience, and humanity.